Hi everyone, this is Casey. I wanted to share a quick reminder that enrollment is now open for the next cohort of my signature Paradigm Shift program. This is the program where I personally coach you through taking action with the essential skills and mindsets you need to support your PDA child or teen and make true progress. After every cohort, I ask parents for feedback, and what they say over and over again is that the program is life-changing. It empowered them to transform their relationship with their child and stabilize their home. You can use the link in the show notes to learn more, join the program interest list, or dive right in and enroll for immediate access. Now, on to today's show. Hi, and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. How do I support my nervous system as a parent of a PDA child or teen? So this is an extraordinarily important question because for most parents of PDAers, our nervous systems are the primary and sometimes only accommodation for our child's nervous system difference or disability. So today I'm going to talk about my own experience with supporting my nervous system and some of the patterns that I've noticed within the groups of parents that I've coached or work with in our programs. So this is a question I often get within the privacy of our programming, and I haven't talked a lot about it on social media because it is so personal. But I hope that today, as I share a more intimate story of my own nervous system stress, healing, and support, that it will help you. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself in case you're new to the space. Hi, I'm Casey. I'm the mom of a PDA son who is 10, named Cooper, and a 6-year-old who we are not sure what his neurotype is quite yet, William. He's 6, and the founder of At Peace Parents. So in my previous life, I was a researcher and an academic. I have a doctorate in social science, methodology, and political science. And I was living and working in Washington, D.C. in a very large research nonprofit that also worked in policy. But my PDA son went into burnout. And at the time, I had no idea what that was or even what neurodiversity and sensory processing and co-regulation meant. But we were at a point where our family couldn't function because of the level of distress and crisis that my son was experiencing. So I left my career, and my husband and I couldn't afford to live in the Washington, D.C. area without 2 full-time salaries. And so we decided to move back to the state where I'm from and where both of us went to college, which is Michigan. So I was not in a good place when we moved, and I was extraordinarily burned out myself. So when we first moved back, I put my son in part-time preschool and was working through the sensory processing lens. So I didn't even understand like low demands and autonomy and all of that. And in the time that I had when he was at preschool, my entire focus was like, how do I get myself back to a place where I can even be around him in a calm way without a ton of reactivity? Because I could see that it was just leading to these downward spirals and dysregulation for both of us, which I know is very common for parents of PDAers. 3 reasons. 1, because you're basically constantly bombarded by the sensory input of another human who is exhibiting pain and distress, not just emotional sadness or upset, but rather the sounds, physical sensations, and visual input of a child who's in fight or flight, freeze, panic, shutdown. Okay, so biologically, we're going to be wired to have our own panic response in response to our children having a survival response. Second, and I want to normalize that, like, of course, it's difficult for your nervous system to provide caregiving and de-escalation and accommodation to your PDA child because it is constantly receiving all of those signals of distress from their nervous system. The second reason is that whether or not you're fully aware of it now, it is likely that either you, your partner, your sibling, or one of your parents is neurodivergent or PDA autistic themselves, okay? So it's very common within our programming and coaching containers to work with families who, through the process of learning to accommodate and understand their child, realize, oh, a lot of these mechanisms of how the brain and nervous system work actually apply to me and how I experience things internally. So it's very common. Otherwise, if a parent is not neurodivergent or PDA themselves, they often reflect and understand their parent as maybe being PDA and being raised by an undiagnosed, unaware PDA and receiving things like equalizing or their parents' unexpected meltdowns or dysregulation, which as a child you internalize as your own fault. Okay, so then we have this degree of patterning from our childhood that makes it harder to be around our PDA child or teen. And then I think genetically, most of the people who find my world or find at peace parents, and maybe this is just bias or who's attracted to me, but I would say the vast majority have their own degree of anxiety, whether genetic or because of the parenting experience. Okay, so for those of you listening as a podcast, I'd love for you to reflect on, do those 3 patterns that Casey mentioned potentially relate to my own experience as a parent of a PDA-er? Am I an anxious person genetically, or have I become anxious because of constant signals, nervous system activation from my child? Am I potentially neurodivergent and therefore I have my own nervous system sensitivities and I'm more of a porous human where I'm not able to filter out all the sensory and perceptual input and I can get overwhelmed easily by that? Or third, am I potentially neurotypical, but maybe I was raised or my partner was raised by an undiagnosed PDA? Okay, so that's just a point of reflection because it will have to do with the topic of conversation today, which is healing and supporting your nervous system and getting to the patterns underneath what is causing your reactivity. And this was true for me as well. Okay, so when I moved from Michigan, when my son was in preschool, the thing that I would do to care for myself, and the only thing I felt like I could manage, was to go to the wellness center and float in the sauna with like sensory deprivation with my ears under the hot water. So I couldn't hear anything. And I had like all this hot water around me. I wouldn't work out or do any exercise. I would just float. And then I would take my book out of my locker and go into the sauna and have like another intense sensory experience of heat while I read books that I was reading in order to help me understand my PDA son. So the first and most profound book that I read on my beginning of my nervous system healing journey doesn't have a cover anymore because that's how many times I have reread it and referred to it and written things in it. It is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. So this book, if you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it because it gives you a sense of 3 really important things, both for your child and for yourself. The first is the landscape of how we understand how to help people with mental health and struggles with anxiety and potentially undiagnosed neurodivergence is often looked at as 2 options, right? So we have therapy, which is often talk therapy or cognitive therapy. And then we have medication, right? And I will say I have done tons of talk and cognitive behavioral therapy since I was 26. So I'm not bashing it. And I also am on anti-anxiety medication and SSRI. Okay. So I'm not bashing these 2 traditional options to helping with mental health or potentially managing as a neurodivergent person. But the point of this book is to say, hey, we're missing this third part of the tripod, which is body-based healing of encoded trauma. So his point, which is in the title of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, is the medical system has missed this third prong of like, how do we actually get out of the brain and into the body itself to heal some of our trauma and support our nervous system, which is causing a lot of these challenges, whether it, ruminative thoughts, anxiety, you knowing how to accommodate a PDA child, but you're so activated in your nervous system, you actually can't stay calm, or you have reactions that you feel ashamed of, which is true for all of us. Okay. And then the last third of this book actually has a chapter dedicated to examples of each of the types of new evidence-based therapies that are showing ways to get into the body and heal and support the nervous system and trauma. And so I dove into this and was in the sauna, like underlining things and making notes and being like, look at all these modalities that maybe I intuited in my 20s. I did and still do a lot of yoga as a healing modality. But there were all these other examples that I hadn't heard of, like neurofeedback, internal family systems, EMDR, and somatic experiencing, etc. So I was like, okay, I think I need to start doing some of these more body-based approaches because I've done so much work on my anxiety, and yet I still struggle so much with panic attacks and ruminative thoughts, etc. And I'm having trouble managing myself, even though I know cognitively what my son needs. And I think, I've worked with enough parents to know that this is a very common experience. And it's not just you, if you're the one listening, of like, I know how to accommodate my PDA kid. I know that I'm supposed to be, not reacting in the moment, but like my body just does it and I can't seem to help it. Okay. So this is what this talk is about, is to help you get to those underlying patterns. So what I decided to experiment with first, and I've been doing for the last 5 years, is called EMDR. And I should have prepared before this coffee with Casey and been like, what exactly is that acronym? Because I always forget, but it's like eye desensitization movement. So the whole thing with EMDR is that you're doing something that allows your brain to cross the midline from the left to right hemisphere, either by following a light that goes back and forth left to right, or when I was doing this during the pandemic and everything had to be virtually, I was on a screen with the therapist on a Zoom call, and then I would follow like a blue ball across a white screen that went back and forth. And when I did it in person, I would have buzzers. So it would buzz one hand and then buzz another. So you're going back and forth across the midline of your brain as you reprocess things from your childhood or the past that might be making it much more difficult for you to stay in the present moment, calm and non-reactive with your child. Okay. So over the past 5 years of EMDR, I have grown a lot in my capacity to understand the underlying patterns of my life that were influencing how I responded and reacted to my child. And I want to share some of those with you. So during the reprocessing, I reprocessed some things from my childhood, from being a child who was a perfectionist and tended to freeze and dissociate, and was navigating her parents' divorce, the birth of my son, which was extremely traumatic, and we had like an emergency C-section, and it was very difficult, the aftermath of the birth of my son, and then the crisis of him going into burnout. So all of this work in the therapy space was much harder than I thought it would be. Okay. And I want to share this with you because if you're considering this, I want to give you some tips and lessons so that you don't go into it blindly, kind of like I did, of like, let's give this a try. So the first thing that I noticed as I did this reprocessing, especially in the first 6 months, was that it was absolutely exhausting for my body and my nervous system. Okay, so I would do like 45 minutes of reprocessing with EMDR, and I would come home and feel like I needed to take like a 2 or 3 hour nap. And sometimes I couldn't because I would be going to pick up my son and having the afternoon with him. And so I would be very dysregulated immediately afterwards. And it would be even harder for me to stay calm in the face of the accommodating and the caregiving and his dysregulation. So even if I wasn't able to take a nap right afterwards, I would sometimes have to go to bed at 7 or 8 and just completely fall asleep. So the absolute exhaustion of doing this was not something I anticipated. So it's something you want to think about in terms of creating space either in your schedule, the timing, or in your support system of hey, I'm going to be doing EMDR. I might be scheduling it for the morning instead of right before I pick up my kids. Or, I'm going to be needing my partner to be doing more of the caregiving on the days that I do EMDR. Okay. The second thing which I mentioned was that I, in the immediate aftermath, felt more dysregulated, right? Which is very common when we're doing trauma processing or body work. And there's a polyvagal theory reason for this, especially for someone like me and for many of you, especially if you're an internalized PDA or if you're more of a fawn response to stressful situations or a freeze response, is that, you might have been going into what's called dorsal, which is kind of like a shutdown response or a freeze response where you have this mobilization of your nervous system to fight flight, but then it clamps down into dorsal where it's you shut down and you can't actually do anything in response, like a deer in the headlights. So as you're reprocessing some of those moments or times in your life, your nervous system is hierarchical. So it's going to move back up through fight, flight, or mobilization, which can make you feel dysregulated. Anger may come up, resentment, feelings that you might not have expected, especially if you're someone who doesn't normally get mad or someone who avoids conflict or someone who doesn't like to have confrontation. You probably have a nervous system pathway that's not fight or flight. So at the same time, EMDR did help me start to have some distance and be able to separate my son's dysregulation, meltdowns, nervous system activation from patterns and responses and experiences that I had in the past, which it was very important to create that distance so that I could respond in the moment and not with all of this baggage from every other traumatic thing that my body had experienced. The other thing that happened to me, and I know this is going to resonate with some of you, especially those of you who may not be fully understanding of your own neurotype at this moment. The other thing that happened to me was my sensory sensitivities exploded. Okay, so I was always someone who, up until I was 26 and started having panic attacks, did not consider myself anxious. And then all of a sudden, I was living in New York City, going to Columbia University, and having big panic attacks where I would completely dissociate. I would feel like I was having a heart attack, tingling up my spine, chest pains, all the things, okay? Which is when I started on medication, going to therapy, doing yoga, all the things. But I, at that point, did not feel that I had sensory sensitivities. I could be in a coffee shop and just tune everything out and study. I could be around noise and it didn't bother me. I was not a picky eater or anything of the sort. But as soon as I started really doing this deep work of trauma processing, I started to have very big sensory responses. So, for example, I would be laying in bed at night and I wouldn't be able to look my husband in the eyes. It was too intense for me. And I would be like, I just need to shut my eyes while we're talking. What's interesting is that I no longer feel that way. And it's very rare that I have those moments when it's so intense I can't look into his eyes. But in the months after starting EMDR, I couldn't look into his eyes. So this, of course, is making me think, well, am I autistic? And I just didn't know exactly what was going on, because when I would meditate, I felt like my body needed to move and rock, which felt very uncomfortable and weird to me. And it totally brought up, oh, I'm ableist. Why am I not letting myself why am I judging myself because my body wants to move in this rocking way? And like, am I judging others and all these things? And then I remember it was like 3 years ago, maybe more, where I moderated at PDA North America some of the breakout groups with parents of PDAers to support them to connect with one another. And it was really wonderful and fulfilling and meaningful. But I got off that moderation and I could not function. I couldn't speak. I needed to be in a dark room. I got under a weighted blanket with a rice bag over my eyes. And I couldn't really interact. And again, I was like, what is going on? Am I autistic, or is this just trauma healing, right? Because you can also have an increase in sensory sensitivities when you're working on the nervous system. So this is all very confusing for me. And I started to have to use noise canceling headphones. I would gag when I had to take out the trash and I needed my husband to do it. Smells became overwhelming. Some of this has since dissipated, which is interesting because it has not been consistently that intense. However, it certainly was in the aftermath of my first 6 months of really doing this type of work. So at the same time, I was going through all of this questioning of am I autistic? Am I just healing from trauma? What is happening? I was super confused and also got more confused by being a public face in the PDA space because at the time I was getting a lot of negative feedback, trolling, and even attempted cancellations, not from the medical community or therapists, but from the autistic community. Because I was responded to as you should not be talking about this because you're not an autistic woman, even though I was talking about parenting and a parenting experience. So I had a very early and very negative experience with the online advocacy community for autism and for autistics. And so I was at the time exploring my own identity while receiving all of this really judgmental and negative feedback. And I was at a point where my nervous system was more sensitive than it had ever been. And so, of course, I'm not going to feel autistic pride, I'm an autistic person and woman and identity first and all of this. And also, that's not my personality. I've never had a strong identity first vibe. That's never been me. Okay. And I perceive identity as the intersection of lived experience and internal experience and belonging. And so it's where you feel you belong in intersection with your internal lived experience. So when I work with families and parents, especially when they're going through their own work on their nervous system and their own self-awareness, there's two kind of pathways that we see with parents who realize that they're neurodivergent. One is what I experienced with my son when I learned about PDA, which is the veil comes off, everything in your life makes sense. Versus what I personally have experienced, which is, I'm not sure. I have a lot of doubt. I don't know if this is neurodivergence and trauma or just trauma or neurodivergence. And I, frankly, I still don't fully know. So I want to name and validate that those two paths exist, right? And we hear more about the the veil comes off, it's 100% clear. Thank God my whole life makes sense. And then my journey, which has been one of self-acceptance also around doubt of not knowing and accepting my differences, even if they don't fit clearly into a particular way of viewing a neurotype. So this came out of EMDR specifically, but EMDR is just one of many modalities that I have done and have supported me, which I'm happy to talk about more, including havening, internal family systems, the safe and sound protocol, shamanic work, somatic experiencing, and some others. So here are the things that I want to just leave you with as a reminder if EMDR feels like a next right step for you to support your nervous system as you parent a PDA child or otherwise dysregulated, hypersensitive nervous system, neurodivergent human. So, as I said before, if you start EMDR, you're going to be exhausted. It's really important that you find a therapist who knows how to shepherd you through this. The good news is that because EMDR is evidence-based, you can find therapists who are covered by insurance to support you through it, which was really important earlier on in my journey. But I should have found someone who was more aware of the potential for flooding and oversensitization. So if you have any form of anxiety or neurodivergence, you might want to start with like 30 minutes or 15 minutes instead of a full 45-minute or 60-minute session, which is what I do now. Like everything else, both what I teach in terms of supporting a PDA child and what helps parents through this journey, it's not a magic bullet, but a peeling back of layers. And if you are a PDA parent, PDA identifying parent or otherwise neurodivergent, you are going to want to go slow and with lots of care and compassion and do it in an experimental way to find how you can adapt it to your needs. Meaning, as I said before, maybe not pushing through a 60-minute session and rather doing smaller sessions and seeing how your body responds to it. So I hope that was helpful for those of you who are here on the topic of healing and supporting a nervous system of a parent who is the primary accommodation for their child's disability. And I will be sharing more about the other modalities that I've done in order to support you. All right, my friends, bye. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.